This is sort of a Chinese taster session that myself and my colleague have been kind of asked to give. My name is Dr. Justin Winslet. I teach classical Chinese and sort of pre-modern Chinese history and culture.
I'm Dr. Karina Smith, and until very recently I was teaching the classical Chinese component of the undergraduate course for the first year here at Oxford. So today we're just going to, first we're going to explain what the course BA Chinese Studies involves, and then move into more of a taster, sort of give you a sense of what we do, particularly on the classical Chinese component of the course. But as we will explain, these things are actually, the different course components are quite interrelated.
So a little bit about the sort of course. Again, you might, this is mainly for the taster, but we just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an idea. So, you know, there are probably others, you might have other sessions, and of course, you know, you can contact people in the faculty and things, and about sort of the nitty gritty, as it were, of the course. But the important thing about Chinese studies at Oxford, and actually this applies to several other universities, but at Oxford, we kind of think of Chinese studies as basically sort of being made up of kind of three components. One is the modern Chinese language, which for our purposes is also known as Mandarin. You might be familiar with a few other modern Chinese languages like Cantonese. Mandarin is the language you learn. That's the official language in the People's Republic of China and in Singapore, one of the official languages of Singapore. It has a lot of currency. There's reasons you do that. Also, a second component to the course is classical Chinese. And we'll obviously be giving a little bit more of a talk about that and sort of what's involved, and kind of exposing you to a little bit of classical Chinese. And then the third portion is this kind of amorphous, vague thing that we would call sort of studies. And that takes into account quite a lot of different things. This is sort of the history, the literature, the sort of the politics, economics. I mean, it can vary, even art, all of that. And as I said, if you're curious as to like the distribution and what the core classes are, obviously you can ask that and look that up a little later. But one of the other things I just want to like underpin with this kind of discussion about the course is that it's important to realize that it's not just a language course. You're not doing it just to learn the Chinese language. As I've just explained, you actually learn two languages automatically on it. And furthermore, the whole point, and what you're going to see in this taster, is that the language underpins all of the other things. So the studies, what you would be doing on the course in terms of the studies, that is very strongly supported by the language. In other words, you're being taught the language to do the studies. And that might be a little confusing to you right now, but it'll probably make a little bit more sense as we get into the sort of the kind of taster class that we've got for you today. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think something that people often ask about is the subsidiary languages. I think that's a kind of popular question.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's a little bit more, again, of the nitty gritty, but I think just for your information, it is possible to do subsidiary languages with what that means is 2 years in your final 2 years of either for Chinese, that would be either Japanese, Korean, or Tibetan. But this, again, that's more of a kind of more specific thing. Again, it is possible. However, I do want to emphasize that even if you do those subsidiary languages, you're still expected to do sort of Chinese along with it, and you're still doing the studies component. So, and even those subsidiary languages are still focused on the sort of the three elements that we kind of talked about. So it's not like at some other universities wherein you like select two languages and you're really just learning those two languages. Okay. So again, as I really do want to emphasize that Chinese studies is about kind of what we're about to show you, about sort of using language to basically sort of basically actually analyze and learn about something. So let's just see if this works. There we are. So I've just put up on the screen something that might look a little scary, but this is a poem. It is a poem that actually we have done before on the Oxford course. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, about actually this is an incredibly famous poem, and a poem that if you were to learn it and recite it in, well, China, not just China, but Japan or Korea or even Vietnam, most people will know it as they do learn it in school. The title of this poem is Chun Wang, and it is by Du Fu. So Chun Wang can sometimes be translated as spring scene or spring vista. It's sort of, and then Du Fu, we'll talk a bit more about him as a poet. But I thought just for the beginning, Karina, would you like to go through, give us a nice reading?
Bearing in mind that this is in modern Mandarin pronunciation, we'll come to that. So, 国破山河在，城春草木深。感时花溅泪，恨别鸟惊心。烽火连三月，家书抵万金。百草扫更断，横玉无胜餐。
Excellent.
Modern.
Dr. Smith's Mandarin is far better than mine, so it always sounds much better when she says it. Now, just to give you a little sort of kind of rough translation, just again, there are several different ways of translating it. And one of the things about poetry is that poetry is somewhat complex because poetry is innately what we would call multivocal, meaning oftentimes there are many different readings, and good poets want us to know that there are many different readings. But one possible reading of this, to sort of look through in English, would be that, well, the land is broken, yet the mountains and rivers remain. As for the city, in spring, the foliage is thick. Sort of my emotions as my emotions are at the time, well, the flowers are kind of wet with tears. And I'm sort of bitter at I'm bitter at the departure of the birds with a kind of shocked heart. The beacons have been blazing for 3 months, and letters from home are worth 10,000 gold. My hair is white, and as I scratch it, it gets ever thinner. I deeply yearn, yet I'm unable to pin it up. So yes, so I mean that's kind of again a rough one. Again, there are certain things going on. We'll talk a little bit about them, but again, another thing that sort of and again, this is something you would learn on the course. We would learn how to basically read this. Also, many students will contribute basically sort of their own translations, and that's also very fun because that sort of helps us gain a better appreciation for the multivocal layer. So by all means, my sort of rough translation herein should not be taken as the translation, but rather that's informed through sort of my readings. Now, sort of, so if you were a bit sort of unnerved by that, this is the sort of writing of the poem in sort of basically what we call pinyin. Do you want to explain what pinyin is?
Yeah, so pinyin is a way of transcribing the sounds of modern Mandarin using the Roman alphabet. The big thing that I think always is worth drilling home with the students is pinyin is not a system that's made for foreign, typically Western people coming from native language backgrounds where the Roman alphabet will be their alphabet. This is not a system made for foreigners to help them learn Chinese. Pinyin is a system of transcribing the sounds of Mandarin that was developed within China for the purposes of the use of China itself. And so from time to time, well, there are ways that it transcribes the sounds of Mandarin using Roman letters from the Roman alphabet that to us as English speakers, or indeed other European language speakers, seem really off, and you're like, why have you used this letter to notate that? But in any case, it largely serves the purposes, and it's a standardized way of notating the sounds of Mandarin. You'll probably be drawn to the little, what you would call the diacritic marks, the little dashes over vowels in the pinyin. I'm just probably wondering what's going on there. I'm sure you've heard of the tones of Mandarin. So Mandarin has 4 tones. So the high tone, rising tone, low tone, and falling tone. And the diacritic marks, these dashes, are supposed to sort of graphically show that pitch to notate the tone. So that's what's going on with the pinyin there. Very loosely. Yeah.
Yes, and each of these pinyin correspond exactly to one of those characters. I mean, I did not address that. I think most people now, when I started in the past, you still had to kind of explain this, but I think most people now are familiar with Chinese orthography, that it's generally written in characters, which we've already shown you. So, and each of these has an innate sound in Mandarin, as Karina has wonderfully sort of pronounced and explained here as listed here. Certainly for early learners, I know that lots of early learners like to kind of use the pinyin quite a bit, but as Dr. Smith quite rightly said, it's not used. No one in China uses pinyin to actually write. It's used to input, and you will see it mainly when they need to translate things and like names and things. But it's, again, people use characters. That's how they read, that's how they write. And so that's actually one of the things about the Oxford course compared to other courses. You actually start out right away with characters, which is a very good way to learn. But that's kind of how you write and how you read. Okay, but reading and writing is not just about knowing the sounds and being able to recognize the what we would in linguistic terms call glyphs or characters herein. It's also about basically understanding sort of the grammar now and the poetics. Now, before we get to the grammar a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about the poetics, because a poem has poetics. And poetry is very interesting because poetry has very, very, very strict rules that govern over how you actually can write a poem. There are many different, what we call modes. This could be understood as types of poetry in many different languages. But ultimately, although it is incredibly strict in terms of how it's supposed to be written, it's actually also supposed to be incredibly free in the way in which a person expresses themselves. So actually, the poetry represents a kind of paradox in writing, in which it's the most constricted and yet also simultaneously the most free form of writing. Now, in terms of the poetics, normally we think of poetics as having 2 things, rhythm and rhyme. Now, there is poetry that doesn't rhyme. So normally we usually go to the rhythm. Now, herein in this poem, there is a definite rhythm. You can kind of see that quite obviously. And this is sort of part of, again, when we mentioned sort of the way Chinese is written, it can kind of really highlight the rhythm in poetry, so in English, we tend to think of rhythm as a matter of the number of syllables to each line. Now that's because although Chinese words do have multiple syllables, the way in which each character is written and the sound of each character can be thought of as 1 syllable. So you can easily see that since you have 5 characters for each sort of unit, what we could call a line, you basically can see that this would be pentatonic effectively, which is a very standard and actually ancient mode of Chinese poetry. This is one of the most basic sort of ways. Interestingly enough, just by coincidence, that's also a very ancient way of writing English poetry. Pentatonic tends to be favored by a lot of languages. Now, so that is actually the rhythm. And if you notice, each line, as graphically very clearly illustrated on this slide, is broken by a comma. And these lines form couplets. This is another important part of Chinese poetry. Chinese poetry, it has to be in couplets. In theory, what this means is that basically the smallest poem just cannot be 2 lines. In practice, usually you see 4 lines, which make up 2 couplets. Now, that's the kind of the basic rules of rhythm. Now, in terms of rhyme, well, the basic rule of rhyme is that principally the last sound of each line of each couplet should rhyme with each other. But if Karina was to read the last word in the first 2 lines.
So 生 and 心.
No, 在 and 生.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So 在生.
Yes, and then the next. Yeah, and then.
泪先月间短餐.
You noticed none of those really rhymed with each other. So that suggests that Du Fu is doing something a little different here. He's basically not having each couplet, the last unit, the last sound of the line of the couplets sort of rhyme. But okay, that may not be his rhyme scheme. He's decided to sort of go against the grain and kind of do something different. But then let's have a look at sort of the last. So that sort of rhyme scheme we would call AA and then BB, but that does not exist. Okay, well, let's see if we have an ABAB. So if basically, Karina, could you read every other line?
So 在月 and 累 and 短.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now notice how those don't really sort of rhyme either. So basically we can tell that after the first line of each couplet clearly isn't rhyming. But what about basically the second line of each couplet?
So 生 and 煎 and 心 and 餐.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now those sound a bit closer, but they still don't rhyme perfectly. So that leaves us with a couple of conclusions. One, it doesn't rhyme. Du Fu decided to just go against the grain completely and throw away all rhymes. That is possible. Okay, but as I would tell my students if they were suddenly to suggest that, I would say that might be a bit of a kind of lazy approach, because it sort of then says, oh, we don't have to do any more work. We're done. We're happy. And the thing is that although, again, it is perfectly possible to have non-rhyming poetry, that's very unusual. You don't expect it. Most of Du Fu's other poems do rhyme. So this raises another question that we need to then raise. And as Dr. Smith's sort of reading indicates, the shan xin jin zan, they do kind of sound a little similar. Like it does, they are sometimes what we might call near rhymes. Well, this is because, so actually it does rhyme. The issue herein is that we are reading it in Mandarin. And Mandarin is not the language that Du Fu would have spoken and not the language that he would have written in. In fact, he would have been writing in a language which gave rise to Mandarin. But Du Fu, basically, he wrote in a language and spoke a language we kind of collectively call Middle Chinese. That's not really the name of a specific language, as it refers to the languages sort of being spoken over about 1,000 years ago. Okay, and so as such, the sounds of that were very different than the sounds today. This is no different than any other language. One only needs to look at English spelling. If you notice, a lot of the words in English we spell with lots of extra letters that we don't pronounce, or with very strange letter combinations that are pronounced sort of differently. An example would be knife and knot, both spelt with K's at the start, but we do not read them as knife and knot. But the reason they're spelled that way is a long time ago, English speakers did pronounce them as knife and knot, that was their pronunciation, that this kn was an actual sort of sound that people spoke. Over time, that changed to where we just pronounce it as an n, and our writing system just hasn't changed. We just decide, okay, when we learn how to write knife, we learn it's with a K, we just don't pronounce the K. So many languages do this. And if you actually were to read these sort of sounds in the sort of in sort of Middle Chinese, what you basically get with this is you would get something more like basically shim, shim, kim, and then trim, which are very, very good rhymes. So those last ones in red, that would be how they would all be read in Middle Chinese. Now, you could then say, oh, but then let's go back to the sort of the first line of each couplet and then see, okay, maybe they do. Well, that's possible too, and you should do it. But that would come out to be more like joy and then lai, and then nuet, and then basically duan. So Du Fu's still violating the kind of poetic rules herein. He does have a rhyme scheme, but he's decided to make his rhyme scheme sort of not zero, no rhyme, A, zero, no rhyme, A, zero, and then A, which is very, very peculiar for this type of poetry. And sort of, again, illustrates sort of Du Fu's sensibilities and kind of how he is as a poet, which I think Dr. Smith's going to talk a little bit more about.
So Du Fu was around in the 8th century, which corresponds to the Tang dynasty. You may have heard of it, sometimes referred to with very kind of gushing monikers such as, China's golden age. But the Tang was from around sort of the beginning of the 600s to the beginning of the 900s, and Du Fu was around very much in the middle of that period. His entire life, his life trajectory, it starts out with what is quite a very familiar standard biography for a sort of a male figure from pre-modern, certainly medieval China. His home really would have been the capital, or near to Chang'an, and he was the son of a minor official, and from a young age he was brought up, raised, studying for the civil service exams to enter into service in government as an official. And so to this end he was taught what are called the Confucian classics, had to study these and then sit an exam on these. As I said, this is very much the typical biography for a sort of illustrious male figure from pre-modern China. He failed the civil service exams, and then that kind of really began his forays more into other things. We have some examples of his poetry from earlier in his life, and a significant point in his development as a poet was when he met the other very famous Tang Dynasty poet, Li Bai or Li Bo, who at the time would have been a little bit older than Du Fu, and so they did have an encounter. And while it was not particularly sort of deep or long-lasting friendship in any way, I think there is some speculation that encountering Li Bo, Li Bai, who's very much embodied the kind of reclusive, slightly eccentric poet, kind of put this idea into Du Fu's head that one could be this recluse, one could have take a view or take a position that was perhaps a bit outside of officialdom, and be creative from that kind of standpoint. The really significant point in his life that we're interested in, and that ties into our reading of this poem, is the Anlushan Rebellion, which happened in 755. This was an uprising, an insurgency against the Tang government dynasty by a usurping force. And while it ultimately was not successful, it lasted for a very long time, and certainly it lasted for the remainder of Du Fu's life. So it happened when he was middle-aged, and at the time that he died in 1770, it was still very much kind of in full force. And the impact that the Anlushan Rebellion happened on Du Fu is it forced him and his family into a more itinerant lifestyle. They had to move around in response to this uprising, and at the same time, and probably not at all helped by the rebellion, he was in poor health. So I think having to move around a lot, obviously the stress and trauma of this experience not helping his health. And so what does this mean for us? Well, First of all, I think it's really important to say that in different literary and poetry traditions, criticism traditions, in certain traditions, what we would call biographical criticism is not such a big thing. We can read, or we should, or we move within a tradition of reading literature and poetry where we're not super concerned perhaps with the details of the life of the person to whom it's attributed. The question of how much the author is a figure in our reading. Okay, there are traditions of criticism that say to move beyond this, but it's certainly a fact to say that in the long tradition of appreciating and reading Tang Dynasty poetry, biographical criticism is a big thing. And we can make a strong argument that pre-modern Chinese poets wrote their poetry knowing that there would be a biographical criticism of it. And so they would be writing their poetry in anticipation that it would be read as reflecting upon themselves, and that the sparsity, and as Dr. Winsett was saying, the kind of polyvalence of how it can be read, the poet would know that facts of their life would be used by a reader to try and tease out different possible readings and passings of the poem. So it is important that we engage with this tradition of biographical criticism, because it's very much real in the story of how Du Fu's poetry has been appreciated. So with that in place, we can now go back and start to reread this poem with this understanding of him in mind, and kind of coming back briefly to the biography itself, the biography proper, and with that kind of caveat about biographical criticism in mind. Contemporary scholars in Tang poetry studies would often give the appraisal, it's quite a sort of widely accepted appraisal, that if we look at the body of Du Fu's work, bearing in mind there was work from earlier in his life that perhaps we don't have now, it's strongly felt that his most prolific and his best and finest and most nuanced work was produced in this period of great disruption and suffering for him, during this period of the rebellion when his life was really uprooted. And it seems to be that his creativity really was galvanized by these unfortunate events in his life. So yeah, I think that with that in mind, we can kind of go back and read again and see how we can kind of plug in the poem into this context, and thinking about perhaps concentric circles of context and the relationships between them, the parallels, what's happening at this kind of cosmic level perhaps of a dynasty collapse, an environmental collapse, the state, what's happening on the temporal level, being at this point of supposedly a time of hope and resurgence, perhaps not a bit unironic there. And then obviously on the personal level, what's happening for Du Fu and his family, what's happening to him as he declines in health. So yeah.
Well, just again to take a little diversion, we'll return to that a little bit, but just another thing again to kind of re-emphasize. One of the things as I keep pointing out, and Dr. Smith keeps pointing out, is that language really does underpin all of this. So another thing that we can kind of ask ourselves about this poem is also how it's sort of written. Now, I've already talked about the sort of the rhythm, and I've talked about the rhyme, but actually there's also grammar. Now, one of the big myths of poetry is that grammar just kind of goes out the window. That's not true at all. Grammar is still present. The basic grammar, whether you write in prose or poetry, you need to follow the grammar of a language. Now, the language that's written here is what we would kind of term classical Chinese. As I told you, that is basically one of the three main components of the course. You do it for 4 years, as you do Mandarin and the studies portion. But just to, again, we can, of course, grammar-wise, we can sit down and break down the entire poem and, spend quite a lot of time. But just to give you a little sort of overview of what the basic grammar in classical Chinese, which actually is not different from the grammar of Mandarin. Mandarin's based ultimately on classical Chinese. And that is that basically we would call this, as many of my former students will often constantly sort of complain about. Basically, have them drill this into their heads. Basically, subject, verb, object, and modifier head. What this means is that in languages, when you are trying to say something, you usually have a an agent doing an action. And that agent can sometimes be doing the action on something. The agent is what we call the subject. The action is what we call the verb. And the thing that the verb is acting on, we call the object. Now, there are verbs that act on the subject, and as such, you wouldn't necessarily see an object. Many languages, all languages have these components to some degree. However, they're not always organized in the same way. Now, in English, we organize our sentences where we say the agent first, so the subject, then we tell someone what that subject is doing, so there's the verb, and then if we want to then say that it's doing something on something, we then have the object. In other words, it's subject, verb, object, which is no different from actually the various forms of Chinese. And that's what you see here. So in this first couplet, the first line in red, that word guo, land, is basically a subject, followed by a verb. And then you have another subject followed by a verb. So you can actually regard those two things as two sort of sentences. Now, because it is poetry and poetry is determined by rhythm, they're fused together. And we actually are, by putting them together, we have to associate them together. If you recall in my sort of rough translation, I said, the land is broken, yet the mountains and rivers remain. I added this particular word in English, we call it a conjunction, to indicate that the dufu is trying to sort of say that these two basically units, these two sentences, are actually somewhat related to each other. So not only are they forced together in the same line, we know that then they are kind of, something's going on that indicates that they're related to each other. Now, in the second line of the couplet, we see something that's very interesting, which if any of you have done some Mandarin or actually even Japanese or Korean, or even Cantonese for that matter, actually many languages, to be honest, you might have heard this word, this kind of sentence type called topic comment. Now, topic comment is a little tricky to explain because in English, we normally don't speak in topic comment. It's possible to do so, but we normally don't do that. In other topic comment, the way a topic comment sentence works is that you have a topic. This is the thing that you want to talk about. And you put that first. And then after it, everything that follows are comments on that topic. Those comments can be full sentences, actually. Now, it is perfectly possible to speak this way in English, but it sounds very awkward to us. Basically, and so actually the best example of this, of anyone speaking in topic comment, is in the sort of Star Wars series, is the character Yoda speaks exactly in topic comment, that constantly putting what seems to be the object first, and then suddenly giving some sort of explanation, that would be topic comment. This is not common in English. That's a fictional character who's speaking that way to sort of indicate sort of his exoticism, but basically in classical Chinese and actually Mandarin, it's very common. So this next line is topic comment. The city, which I've put in purple, is the topic. So the comment after it, this 春草木生, this in spring, the foliage is dense. That's actually a full sentence in its own right. You could take away the city and you could just have those four. Now that wouldn't make a good poem because it would violate the rhythm. And also it would perhaps be a little sort of, it would have a different meaning, but we know that we're talking about some sort of city, which, as Dr. Smith got done saying, probably is the capital. And basically we know that it's in spring because we have a time word, and time words in classical Chinese go before or after the subject. Here they're going before, and then we have another subject, and then we have a verb. Again, this seems a little basic, it's going through, but language really does underpin pretty much everything that we're talking about. And this language and the way in which Du Fu's crafting the poem, exactly as Dr. Smith was saying, sort of plays into sort of this kind of how we read the poem and how we understand it. In other words, this line, as I just got done saying, well, we have the city as the topic. Therefore, we know that we're talking about some sort of city. We're not talking about foliage just throughout the land. After all, the first line talks about the land, the country everywhere around. But now we know that we are in some sort of city. And furthermore, even a more detailed city, because this word city isn't just city, it's a walled city. So, it wouldn't be some sort of random village out in the countryside. And owing to, again, if we apply sort of biographical criticism to this, we know that we're going to be basically then probably have to think, well, Du Fu, he was very eminent. He basically was a scholar. He probably was based in a walled city of great importance, something like akin to, say, the capital. Okay, and that's all revealed just through a simple matter of using, city as a topic, which is somewhat reinforced by the need to have 5 sort of syllables in each line. Would you like to talk about, say, history or literature? So
yeah, I think this is sort of what I was saying before.
Okay, well,
yeah, if you want to go ahead.
Okay, well, here, let's just to kind of pull things together, because we are kind of reaching the end of time. Normally, I mean, we're doing this online. Normally, of course, we like to ask questions, but we don't have that privilege. But to pull this kind of together, I've already pointed out, basically, what we wanted to try and show you herein is that you actually do a lot of different things. We read this poem. It's a very nice poem. I already told you at the start that basically everyone in basically sort of modern China still learns this poem. They learn it at school. They memorize it. If you mention it, the other day I mentioned it just to a Chinese friend, and she immediately just recited it. Okay, so it's still very much part of culture today. But that's not the only reason we read it. But it is inbuilt, and we read it for that reason. But also, if you notice the things we've been talking about, the way in which we've been reading it. One, you need to understand the language. This is written in classical Chinese. You need to understand classical Chinese grammar. You need to understand how it's read. You also need to understand, because it's classical Chinese, probably the way it was pronounced is not pronounced in Mandarin. It's in Middle Chinese. That reveals various things to it. You also need to sort of be aware of basically how the language works. In other words, how characters, how you write, and then how this gets put together in terms of poetics. That's the language side of things. But that language side bleeds quite effortlessly into the history side of things, as Dr. Smith was talking about, the elements of basically, well, we can then understand what's going on in the Anlushan rebellion, what was going on within the larger Tang through the lens of this poem. We see sort of elements in sort of the land being destroyed, sort of the beacons. These are beacons for war. The soldiers have beacons just lasting for 3 months. Basically, the desire for letters from home. But we also see, exactly as Dr. Smith basically stated, biographical elements. The last couplet is just biographical. Du Fu's talking about his age. His hair is white and it's very thin. He can't pin it up. He's no longer a young man. We don't know if this means he's yearning to go off with the soldiers to fight, or if he's lamenting the futileness of war, the fact that he is now old and yet the war is still going on. The rebellion still sort of occupies things. All of those, that sort of pathos, those feelings, all of those sort of, again, emerge just from this simple poem. And it gives us very multiple ways of, again, looking at historical events. Literature is most definitely also presented. I mean, poetry is associated as a form of literature. But think about how Dr. Smith and I have been talking about it. We've mainly been talking about it linguistically and historically. So suddenly we're using something which is normally thought of as just a kind of art form to talk about other sort of areas and disciplines, which again is something that is done on the Chinese studies course. This is very much what, not just the course, this is what Chinese studies really is about. But that doesn't mean that we ignore the poetics or the literary value. After all, I don't know about you, Karina, but I think this poem is very beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that the sort of more analytical linguistic way of breaking it down, I mean, as you had on the slides just before, where we go through, and it may seem incredibly dry, but to be saying, right, the way that I break this unit of 5 down in terms of the relationships between these 5 characters, what is acting as a noun, what is acting as a verb, etc., etc., may seem incredibly dull, but the reality is that that actually helps us, that informs the ways that we can read. And I think this comes back to the coupleting. So the paralleling is a big aspect of the construction. And I don't know about you, but when I read a poem, so let's take, for example, the 3rd couplet. So 烽火连三月，家书抵万金，万金。When I go through those first 5 characters, and I read it as beacon fires linked up 3 months. So I'm obviously in my head putting that together as we've got beacon fire, so we've kind of got like a nominal and noun construction here. Lian, to link up, that's a verb. 3月, 3 months, a time duration, so duration comes after the verb in classical as well as in modern. And I immediately, when I come into the other half of the couplet, the following 5, I'm thinking, okay, let's assume that we've got the same thing going on grammatically in terms of the parts of speech. Is it verb, noun, whatever going on here? It should be parallel sentence structure, parallel syntax, we can call it. And if we look at this, 家书抵万金, 家书, letters from home, again, the 2 character nominal construction, 抵, to be worth, to be that amount, is a verb, and then 万金, 10,000 silver. So this is so again, we've got 2 character noun construction, 1 character verb, 2 character sort of extent or duration of the verb. So we've got this kind of parallel syntax. And so to come back to my point, while it may seem that, okay, to look at which parts of speech each of these characters are kind of corresponding to, that may seem like the domain of the linguist, very dry, very technical. This is a really big part of how we pull together the poem and where its kind of actual flavor and feeling comes from. It informs a first reading and helps us kind of construct a meaning for it. The balance of it as well, it helps with the rhythm. There's a lot of balancing and bringing together different dimensions, linguistic dimensions of what's going on in a poem: rhythm, rhyme, sound, pace, and indeed the kind of the how these couplets kind of decompose grammatically is a part of this, and that's also the basis from which we can start to bring out possible readings. So I think that, yeah, it's these things are very much inseparable, and to sort of regard them as different, perhaps academic domains. Okay, this is history, this is literary criticism, this is linguistics. It's very, very difficult to tease these apart, and I think the separation of these domains is much more a function of the way that our academia is structured in this day and age, much more than that actually was a reality of learnedness and culture. And again, to come back to the biographical aspect, as I said, Du Fu's life story, very much typical for the kind of person who'd be producing poetry, producing art, who would be active in politics, who would be historically significant, shall we say. His background was one where we see him learning the Chinese classics, so he would have been steeped in material that we would consider to be literature, history, philosophy. These would be one curriculum for him. This would be one curriculum for anyone who was literate, learned, able to produce poetry. So we think about sort of the context in which these poems are being produced. They're being produced by someone for whom literature, philosophy, political thought are not really separate domains, and poetics as well being one natural kind of offshoot of this. So yeah, I think that's
okay. And then just because we need to wrap up here.
Yeah.
So just one last thing, so what Dr. Smith was kind of pointing out at the end. As I've already pointed out, this poem is still read today. And it's read not just in China, but also in Japan and Korea and Vietnam. And as such, it's also an access point to understand why. I mean, we can ask ourselves, why is it read so widely in all of these? But it's not just that it's read today, it's been read because this poem is over 1,000 years old. It has subsequently been reread and reread over those more than 1,000 years. This again is sort of means that there's even further ways of understanding it, because we've been talking about the poem from just reading it. But this poem is used by different communities over time and space, which means actually it also reveals a lot about those communities, those people who are using the poem and then rereading it. It creates a series of what we call allusions, references to each other and other things. And as such, again, this underpins the course. Part of the reason we do Chinese studies, part of the reason we teach Chinese studies, and the way we teach Chinese studies is to show you all of these things are integrated, and you kind of do all of them. It is underpinned by the language, it's exactly as we've been saying, and that's why learning the language is so vital. But ultimately, we're learning the language to do other things, to try and understand what's going on and what the language reveals to us. So hopefully, we hope that, you know, you enjoyed this sort of taster and you got kind of some sense of it. Again, don't feel bad if you don't understand everything or whatnot. I mean, that's perfectly fine. But hopefully, you know, you gain something from this. And yes, thank you very much for sort of, you know, having a look at Chinese. And as again, all sort of in terms of more technical questions about the course and other things, you know, and actually sort of suggested readings, as well as sort of some of the things we've been talking about sort of the various things and aspects you do and things to analyze and look at, like poetry itself. Those are available on the website and, you know, will be available for, you know, from basically the faculty. So again, I'm Dr. Justin Winsett, and thank you very much for listening.
Yep, I'm Dr. Karina Smith. It's very strange to not be able to open it up for questions.
Yes,
but,
yes,
yeah.
But again, just to reinforce, generally the faculty is very open to questions. So by all means, you know, I'm not entirely certain how this is being sort of broadcast at the moment, since that seems to keep changing. But you know, if you do have further questions, by all means, please ask.
Thank you.